Vice Chair Terra Lawson-Remer.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think we all agree that we face a crisis in our community with mental health and addiction and homelessness. And I know we've, as a board, collectively, all of us have been working pretty tirelessly to tackle that challenge. And I think our chair mentioned we've invested more in behavioral health than any board ever before. And we've really made those investments. I'm proud of that we've gone from 0 shelter beds to nearly 900 in the last 3 years. We've hired 5 times more county homeless outreach staff. We've launched the MCRT program and created hundreds of new positions. So I think we all recognize the severity of this crisis. And that's really my starting point, is the fact that this was a unanimous action by the state legislature, the Senate, and the Assembly to say we really need to do more and do better to treat people, to provide care to people who are in crisis, that it is morally abhorrent to allow people to just die on our streets and not get the care that they need and deserve. So, I think where I'm starting from is just really a strong commitment to doing everything we can in our power to act with the utmost urgency to address this crisis of mental health and addiction in our communities and tackle the homelessness crisis. So I really appreciate the presentation that Dr. Bergman made. I have a number of questions. I'm trying to better wrap my head around, just looking at the board letter, wasn't, really clear to me all the kind of pieces that would need to be implemented or developed in order to make this operational. So humor me, I just have a number of questions to try to get a better handle on things. I just want to kind of go through what you outlined. So, you outlined that's one of the pieces of the work that would need to happen is greater operational connections between hospitals and community care facilities. So really to the logistics of how this could be implemented. Another item that you mentioned was building out of the locked substance use treatment facilities and the subacute care, because we currently don't need beds. You talked about adding capacity and conservatorship. You said something around the neighborhood of 20 new FTEs, as well as potential, really outlining clinical thresholds and new policies around how to, assess whether people meet those clinical and diagnostic thresholds. You also mentioned alternatives to hospitals for 5150 holds. And in addition to those 4 areas, I know some of our public speakers mentioned about training, other aspects around trainings and protocols. So I think what I'm just trying to wrap my head around is, okay, we know this was passed in September. So what have we done in the last 4 months on these areas to prepare, given that we've already known we've had 4 months?
Well, so I think the sort of time of commencement of work for us has been the signing.
Has been what? Sorry.
Has been the signing of the bill rather than the passage of the bill. Just to note that. I think thing that will be most meaningful in mitigating risk that we see with the turning on of SB 43. Which is really driven, I think, most.
But sorry, I just want to get clear. Yeah. So in the last, 3 months since we knew this was coming, what have we done to prepare? We're acknowledging that you've just outlined a significant body of work that needs to be done. Yeah. So what have we done?
Yeah, so I'm pointing to, pretty directly, the fact that the area of work that can most mitigate risk is in this linkage, the first of the 4 bodies of work that I spoke to, which is connections between hospitals and community care. That's actually an area of work that we've been addressing since before this legislation was even passed. I think we have an opportunity now to really ramp that up, but there have been a couple of initiatives that we've been driving forward that are also at the heart of this work, that we have been also thinking about the utility of in the context of the likelihood of SB 43. And so those 2 are one, the ED Bridge program. So that is a program that is run, administered by the state, and is meant to push into emergency departments capacity to better address substance use disorder, to do kind of exactly what that point.
The ED Bridge program.
The ED Bridge thing, exactly. One of the things that we out of Behavioral Health Services within HHSA have developed is an incentive payment as a part of the admin day payment to encourage hospitals to more quickly and wholeheartedly adopt the ED Bridge initiative within their emergency departments, knowing that this already is, kind of an area of high risk, and that it would be more substantially that in the context of SB 43. So ED Bridge is one that we've been working on, and we've seen, I have to say, and heard from the state a lot of gratitude about the fact that every emergency department in San Diego is participating in ED Bridge. That's unusual across the state, in particular for.
So if they're already participating, I think what I hear, right? I really hear this sort of need to make sure that this is implemented like well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I really hear that. But on the other hand, I've seen what our county has done when we focused on a crisis, right? I've seen us stand up emergency vaccination clinics across our county and vaccinate hundreds of thousands of people nearly overnight. I know in my district, I was intimately involved in standing up a superstation in the Del Mar Fairgrounds. Within a week, we had a superstation stood up. Within a month, we had over 100,000 people vaccinated. And that sounds like a very significant operational challenge in my view, and it certainly experienced it as one.
Yeah.
I really appreciated the leadership of our county Health and Human Services team in driving that forward, and the difficulties and challenges of coordinating with hospitals. We coordinated very closely with our hospital partners to do that. So I'm just, again, you gave me 4 areas, and then there's one more that was outlined by folks testifying, and I'm just trying to really get granular on these operational connections. What is really required? You've talked about the ED Bridge program. We need to build that out. You said we've already been working on it. So what else really specifically do we need to do?
So I think, can you also, I think, share with the Vice Chair the fact that at the same time, because I think this is important to share, that Care Court was also being implemented during the same time on October 1st. And then I think it's also important to share that a vaccination site, we have our nurses, doing the vaccination site is very different than actually a behavioral health component and the complexities of that, because I think it's apples to oranges, because those are very different. I want to make sure that we're very
That's why I'm asking these questions.
I want to make sure that you're very.
Do you want me to ask them to you instead? Would that be preferable?
No. I just want to make sure that we're very clear about how we're sharing information, because I think it's really important what she's asking, so that we're very much more taking a deeper dive into some of the questions that she's asking, because I think they're really good questions. So I want to make sure that we take a deeper dive into them, and that you're including the Care Court stuff, because I know I kind of talked about them, but I think it's really important that we mention that was also being executed at the same time. And then also the funding piece, right? Because when we were in an emergency crisis around COVID, there was funding coming from the federal government specific for that. SB 43, there is not additional funding coming for those programs at this time. And so
I agree. That's part 2 and 4 of the questions I intend to ask Luke. Thank you.
So ED Bridge is a body of work that we've been focusing on since you asked, what have you been doing previous to what it is that we would sort of commence now? ED Bridge is an area of work, also one of the programs that we have been describing in the context of the opioid settlement funds, San Diego Relay, which is a program meant to help people with non-fatal opioid overdose connect to care. That's another program that will be useful in managing.
I mean, I think let me try to ask this slightly differently. I think what I'm trying to better understand is within the context of the programs, and I'm glad to hear, actually, that there's already a few that you have in mind that are very specific, that it's not generally consulting about operational connections, but you have 2 at least very clear programs. I'm trying to better really get a clear sense of what additional work needs to be done on programs that have already been launched to allow us to get to a point of those operational connections between hospitals and community care facilities being robust enough to implement this program. And what are those benchmarks and what is missing, given that we have already had 4 months to move forward on this and better understanding sort of what's next?
So relative to ED Bridge, it's really a question of scale and robustness of the service that we have. What we know works, so people whose job it is to engage with doesn't hold, because the administration of a vaccine is very simple. The engagement of somebody in substance use disorder care is extremely complex, logistically and
So is the idea then that there's going to be additional staffing, people hired for these roles?
I wouldn't say at this point that we know we need additional staffing. This is something we would have to address collaboratively. We have an opportunity now with payment reform in behavioral health services actually to build payments more creatively to try to incentivize that kind of connection. So I wouldn't say at this moment, again, this is something that would have to be discussed in the context of the convening that's proposed, but we have opportunities to configure services so that that linkage is much stronger, so that the presence of addiction care in emergency departments, navigating
using
people
the
out of them.
incentive payments to create those
Correct.
incentives.
That's an opportunity that we're just now able to enjoy because of payment reform.
And that's something that you think could be implemented in how long would you imagine being implemented?
We're rolling out payment reform generally over the course of this year, and actually beginning with levels of care in substance use disorder. So that's a thing that I think we could tackle in relatively short order.
What does relatively short mean?
I think that we would have meaningful things to report at a 90-day report back.
A 90-day report, you think you'll have meaningful progress on this particular budget?
I
Okay,
do.
thank you. Like I said, you gave me 4, and there was one more for me. We got 1 down. The second thing that you mentioned was the building out of LOCS, substance use treatment facilities, because we currently have 0 beds. I think what I'm really struggling with is, clearly we have a huge challenge on this, right? Like, that's obviously a problem. We don't have any beds. This, as my colleague mentioned, in my view, seems to be the most significant hurdle we have to implementation of SB 43, is that there's nowhere for folks to go.
Yeah.
What I'm kind of wrapping my head around is we've been working on this challenge for the last 3 years since I was elected. There are no new resources, as my colleague identified. This is a mandate that didn't come with more money. What is your thinking of how we're going to have more money and more beds, and how many more beds within a year, since that does clearly, when I listen to the hospitals and folks, that's where the rubber seems to be hitting the road. We have nowhere for folks to go. Everyone's saying we need a year so that we'll be able to not have jammed up emergency rooms. What's the plan? Where's the money going to come from? And how many more beds are we going to have in a year?
Yeah. So most of the people who are transported to emergency departments on 5150s in light of SB 43 will have their holds dropped because their intoxications will clear. And what we would anticipate clinically to happen is that those holds would be dropped. Those people would be best navigated into our existing substance use disorder treatment system. We don't need to build new categories of beds in order to serve those people. They represent the predominance of whom we would need to treat. For folks who are, moved toward conservatorship, right? Once we sort of work out what the standards are, what the thresholds are for folks who would be moved towards conservatorship, we would need to have this new locked substance use disorder treatment capacity. It's not a thing, in terms of current clinical practice around substance use disorder. It's not part of the American Society of Addiction Medicine array of levels of care. So we kind of have to invent it. It would need to be in a locked space, and we would certainly talk about what our options are, because the number of beds that we need to accommodate people moving into conservatorship, I don't anticipate being great. Again, especially.
So then I just have a question of a couple, sort of bifurcated follow-up. Good to hear that you don't anticipate that number of beds being great, since I'm also hearing that we don't have much of a plan to produce those beds in the next year. But then why is everyone so worried that our hospitals are going to be overflowing if what you just said is that within 72 hours, most of these folks are not going to be intoxicated and they're going to be released and they won't be needing to move into those beds? So there's like a logical inconsistency. Either we're going to be facing massive overflows of our hospitals and nowhere for folks to go, or we're not.
So, well, first of all, I would say that currently, as has been described to you today, hospital emergency departments are heavily impacted by people with substance use disorder who are, quote unquote, boarding in those settings. And this is not in the context of conservatorship, not in the context of extended holds. This is in the context of every effort and every latitude to connect those people to ongoing care in the community. We currently see high impacts in hospital emergency departments because of that, and it stands to reason that volume will dramatically increase because of SB 43, and so those dynamics would also become I would say, exacerbated.
You're saying the volume of intake, not the volume of people who stay, but the volume of people who are brought in.
Correct, but just people brought in, because it's quite a number of hours before intoxication clears usually. We would anticipate most people being transported.
And you think the number of people brought in will increase because police officers will be more likely to bring people in once this is passed?
Correct. Peace officers would be more like, that's sort of what the, that's to some extent what the authors of this legislation have had in mind, is that peace officers would be entitled to apply 5150 holds to a different category or cohort of people.
So then the challenge that you're really identifying is a sort of a 72-hour challenge of people being brought in because the police officers are now empowered to do so, but then their intoxication wears off, so they don't end up needing a step-down facility, but you end up with more folks in the emergency room, but not really much of a demand. Maybe we need some beds, but not hundreds and hundreds. Is that correct?
That's why the first intervention that I'm describing that I would prioritize most is getting people dropped off into ongoing addiction care so that we increase, or rather decrease the amount of time that they are in the emergency department to try to clear those
Because
beds.
you're having police officers bring them somewhere else other than the emergency rooms.
Well, no, I'm saying in the context of SB 43, peace officers will bring people who fit these criteria to emergency departments because those are the only LPS designated clinical spaces where it would be allowed per the statute for folks to bring them. So they have to go to emergency departments. This relates to the fourth.
Yeah, that was your fourth bucket. Alternatives to hospitals for 5150s holds. So we can skip to that, and then we can kind of go back to number 3.
Great.
So you mentioned we need alternatives to hospitals for 5150 holds. And so I just wanted to better understand, what is it going to take? We said we need reimbursement and regulatory changes.
Yeah.
And so what does it look like? What are those regulatory and reimbursement changes that would be needed to create an alternative to hospitals?
Yeah, this is another thing that we've been thinking about for quite some time, actually, and that we've been working on advocating at state levels for quite some time. I think SB 43 will provide us a better opportunity to make headway on that front. The clinical service that I would really have in mind would be one that already exists in our San Diego County continuum of care, and that is as a first order of business, a hospital-sited community crisis stabilization unit. So we have both community-sited crisis stabilization units and hospital-sited crisis stabilization units. We talk about them all the time. CSUs are regulated in such a way that the only care that's allowable in them is mental health crisis care, not substance use-related care. That would be.
And that's a state regulation.
That is a state regulation.
So you think in the next year you have a plan, or you think we can make a plan? I shouldn't say you have a plan. You think we can make a plan to both get the state legislation changed to allow substance use disorders to be treated in those facilities and get funding to build them?
I wouldn't say that the building of additional, we already have plans to build a 7th. I think we're holding steady for the time being.
Do we have plans to build when are those going to be constructed?
So the commencement of the next CSU to be built that's a community CSU, so it's not among those that I would target for expansion of this kind of regulatory, or the establishment of this kind of regulatory relief. That's in East County. We're expecting construction there to begin in the spring. But what I would focus on would be our hospital-affiliated and cited CSUs. So we have one at Palomar, we've got one at Bayview, and then we have our
And do
CSU
they
at the Psych
currently have
Hospital.
enough capacity if they're not expanded?
I would say they do have enough capacity.
Even without any additional
As important complements to emergency departments. So I'm not suggesting that the entirety of the volume that we're seeing in emergency departments would go into CSUs. I'm saying that they can be an important part of what we do to mitigate harms that might be caused by the overwhelming volume that we would otherwise see in CSUs.
And so the key step here would be amending state legislation to allow us to utilize those CSUs for substance abuse disorders.
I'm not certain that we would need a legislative fix. This is a regulatory problem. So it's possible that we could get regulatory latitude without legislation.
But if there is a legislative fix, we're happy to. We're going to have a legislative discussion on number 13, and I'm happy to ensure that, I think that this work group, I just want to make sure, because I think we still have a couple of other folks that want to speak, but if there, I think one of the things, Vice Chair Lawson-Remer, is that is why this work group is so important, because we are not the experts, right? I mean, you are one of the experts, but the reason why we're going to have lived experiences, folks with lived experiences, the reason why we're going to have hospital experts, providers, and the other folks from the municipalities and EMTs and firefighters and anybody else be part of this committee is that they will be able to be part of the discussion, and they will be able to provide some of these sort of what else do we need to do to break down those barriers.
Right.
And I think that there's enough power in the room to say that if there is some regulations that we need to change. I mean, what we did with SB 94, what we did with CareCord, with what we can do with CSAC to change regulations, we have a governor that is committed, we have a state legislature that's committed, and I believe that we can do this.
That's very helpful. So this is extremely helpful. So let me just then add the last kind of question I had, and then sort of summarize and make sure I'm really clear. The last bucket, or you two more buckets. One was about adding capacity in their conservatorship office.
Yeah.
And so you had two kind of buckets around that. One, which was clinical thresholds and training around clinical thresholds, and the other is hiring new people. And we don't quite know how many new people, but we know we're going to need some new folks, and we're going to need to hire them. So on the establishing and training around clinical thresholds, what's the sort of best case time horizon on doing that?
So this is a body of work that counties across the entire state are taking a very aggressive approach to. So the California Behavioral Health Directors Association has already established convenings with combinations of medical and behavioral therapeutic experts working on the establishment of these thresholds. So we are participating in those. And though we, are aiming to be, one of the first counties to implement that work, and I've been in pretty constant contact with CBHDA leadership, we anticipate to progress over the next number of months.
Like 2 months or like 12 months?
I would say like within the next quarter, we should see something coming from that. Within the next 2 quarters, certainly more progress.
That's super helpful. And then the last was around education more broadly on protocols. I feel like that's a question it's not fair to ask you. It'd probably be more appropriate for some of our public safety folks, but I think that's just better understanding, like, what does it mean to train our officers and our peace officers to be able to evaluate folks. And I don't see anyone here, and it's Dr. Bourbon, not fair to ask you those questions, but just as I kind of keep track of what these pieces are. So as I kind of summarize, and I just want to share where this is enormously helpful. I think I obviously did not get a chance to find out any of this information prior to this morning about why, what we've done so far and what would be needed to be done to make this work. I think what I'm really hearing you say is this, the kind of the working around the incentives on the operational connections, the two programs that you mentioned, that we've already made some headway, and you could imagine making some real headway, in the next 90 days. That seems very promising and is where we have already some traction and a lot of room to move. That the locked substance use of facilities, where we currently have 0 beds, we probably won't need very many beds, but we'll need to do something. And I'm not hearing much hope that we're going to get very far in that even in a year, because that's a funding issue. And that sounds like the most kind of naughty piece of the whole problem. But that your anticipation is that we won't have a huge demand for those facilities, because really a lot of these folks are intoxicated for just 72 hours and won't need to be moved into those facilities. So what you're really looking at is the regulatory and reimbursement changes to allow us to use our CSUs for substance use facilities. And I think the chair really adequately addressed that we can be partners in making those changes. And then you talked about that we, in the next 2 to 3 months, real hope that we can make progress on these clinical thresholds for our training conservators. And so I think this is super helpful. I think listening to all this, and I'm just really trying to weigh and balance the fact that obviously we need to do this right. These are really important operational considerations. But also I do, know that we have an absolute crisis on these issues in our community. And I have to acknowledge that I am concerned that We haven't made much progress on this, even though it was passed in September. I think if we were having a conversation saying, we were pedal to the metal, right, starting in September, and we've made a lot of progress, but we still need a few more months, I might have had a sort of a different reaction. I think I'm a little concerned that we haven't, we weren't focused with the urgency and the crisis that I think that this demands the minute the legislation passes. So I think that's just to kind of encapsulate what I've been thinking about. I can't support this as currently written because it's just, honestly, a comeback in a year, given that we didn't do much since September, feels way too broad for me. But I would be very interested in supporting some kind of plan where, you guys take 90 days, you get as far as you can, you report back, you let us know, and then, you aim to do this as quickly as possible. Maybe it has to take a year, but that you are aiming to go as quickly as possible. And again, this is not a specific amendment proposal. I'm just sort of putting out there kind of where I'm at. If we could have some approach where you're going to make a plan, come back in 90 days, report back with a plan, and then, pedal to the metal and just take this with crisis and urgency instead of saying you've got a year. I'd kind of rather say to you, you've got as little time as possible. Take as little as you need to do a good job. So those are just my thoughts.